Good morning. This is Pastor Daniel. You can probably tell already that this is not our typical Sunday morning location. I'm in my office where I film a lot of the Wednesday night Bible studies in front of my bookshelf. But we had some technical difficulties with last Sunday's edition. The recording, when I looked at it and got ready to edit it and put it online, we had zero audio at all. And so rather than putting up a whole bunch of video with you can't hear anything, I wanted to try to make up for that a little bit, and I really hate that because we had some great special music Sunday. I would have loved for you to hear that, and then we had our message right in the middle. It's a three-part series, The Good Shepherd, and I did not want to put up the first part and the last part and not have anything in between. So what I want to do right now, if you're willing to sit and watch this with me, is a recap of Sunday's message, and I'll be putting some of the things on screen like I do on Wednesday night, and so you'll be able to read along and see some of the pictures and things like that too. So I didn't want to leave kind of the middle part out of this sermon series for those who are watching online. And I know there's several who are doing that. So I apologize for that. I hope that's not an inconvenience, but here we are. And so we're going to make the best of this. So what we've been doing is studying the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And even though we used a few other verses last Sunday, we didn't get a whole lot further than that because the 23rd Psalm is based on this relationship of David and God as shepherd. And so if we want to have the kind of relationship where we can quote this psalm for ourselves as David did for himself, if we can claim the promises, if we can claim the benefits, then we need to have our own relationship with Jesus Christ as our shepherd. He claims to be in the New Testament the Good Shepherd. And we read a little bit of that passage Sunday morning. But so we need to have a relationship with God as our shepherd, in which case we need to be the sheep. And sheep are nothing if not followers. And so the two big descriptions of us as followers of Jesus Christ, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Old Testament were sheep who are followers. New Testament, he calls his disciples to be disciples, which are followers, are people who follow God, not people who say, God, come to me, but people say, I'll go where you go and I'll follow. And so that's the example that we need to follow. That's the basis upon which Psalm 23 is written. It is not written so that anybody can claim these benefits. It's written to reassure those who have committed to this relationship, letting God be God and we are his faithful followers, how God will treat us. And so it's a wonderful package of promises. It's a wonderful poetic delivery of what are the benefits of being a sheep. What are the benefits of letting God be God? And so we're the sheep, he's the shepherd. And that's a kind of an astonishing way to start this psalm, that the God of all the universe would kind of want to have a personal relationship as shepherd with each and every one of us. And that's the way God is presented. He created us, he loves us, he wants a personal relationship with us. And so that's a phenomenal thing. But the highest of the high at the time, King David, referred to himself as a sheep. Now we know David was a shepherd. We know that he raised his father's sheep. In fact, he was doing that when Samuel went around trying to find the next king of Israel. And they carted out all of the other disciples and said, is it this one? Is it this one? And they all said no. Until they said, well, who else is left? I don't understand. Samuel went looking for another one, and they said, there's David. He's out in the field. What did that mean? That means, well, he's the one we left with all the sheep. It was not a compliment. He was the runt of the litter in that way. And but that's who God wanted. That's who God chose. That's who God said, that's a man after my own heart, because he had a shepherd's heart. If God is our shepherd, he wants us to then have a shepherd's heart for others. So let's dive in. We're going to look at the rest of the psalm built on that relationship. And it really divides itself into, I think, the way I read it, two categories. The next several are based on the phrase, I shall not want. And that is a section of the provision of God. What does God provide? And that's what we'll be talking about today. The next section after that, and I hope next Sunday's recording works, we'll be working on that, of course, but If we look at it through the sense that verse 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me, is the presence of God. So we have the provision of God and the presence of God. And we'll talk about that provision today, what that looks like, and we'll talk about the presence of God for next week. So let's dive in and read some of this. We see verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And then he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters again. We're the sheep, we're the subservient, we're the ones who submit to being led, we submit to being made. If God is God, then he can do with us what he pleases. Verse 3, he restores my soul, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And so we'll walk a little bit through each one of those. I have some slides that I did for Sunday. We'll be using those. In the first one you'll be able to see on the screen right now says God provides. And there's really, if you say I shall not want, you're really saying I'm not going to have a need that goes unmet. And so there's a God who then provides for our needs, provides for us during this journey that we go with him as we're being led. He provides for us in that way. Before we talk about what God provides, first it's probably important to talk about letting God provide. You and I are full of things like pride, self-centeredness, ambition, the desire to achieve, and probably, if you're like me, if there was an avenue for salvation where we would earn it, you and I would try. It's not where we can earn it. It's a free gift of God, not of works that we do, lest any of us should boast. Paul says that very clearly. But I think he has to say that pretty clearly because we would want to earn our own salvation. Part of what Adam and Eve did in wanting to be God or be like God is if we have the knowledge God has, we can figure out our own salvation. And that's not it. It really is for God to give and us to take, and our pride gets in the way of that. We, I think, have legitimate issues in our life where people want to help us and we don't ask for help, we don't want help, we refuse help. If we're lost looking for directions might be an example. There are any number of other examples. But we have to be in a position where we allow God to give and we receive. That's part of the issue here. And so the different ways in which God provides, if we look at it that way, is the first one is nourishment. He makes me lie down in green pastures, leads me beside the still waters. That is God's way of saying, or David's way of saying, that God takes care of nourishing him, because it is the grass and it is the water that feeds and that nourishes and that rebuilds him. Again, I think it's for us to be hesitant a little bit here about taking this on face value and talking about actual nourishment for our bodies when Jesus referred to the bread and even manna from heaven, all these other things, the wonderful things that are the nourishment of God. He then referred to himself as the bread of life. When he was talking to the woman at the well and she was talking about being thirsty, and he said, I can make sure you're never thirsty again. And she said, I'd love some of that water. And he said, I am that water. I am the living water. And if you drink, you'll never be thirsty again. So I think in this sense, David is talking more about a spiritual nourishment, a different thing than just our physical needs being met. Not that our physical needs aren't always met. Then God provides for us in many ways that way. But that's not the biggest part of what God offers. If we're in this only to have bread on the table and water in our cup, we miss out on the abundance of God. In fact, I think when Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, give us today our daily bread, but then he's already talked about himself as the bread of life, he's really saying, give us our daily dose of the mercy of God. Give us our daily dose of the nourishment that God offers on a spiritual level. And if we ever figured that out, we would be in a better place. And so I think God does provide for us nourishment on a spiritual level. And it's a phenomenal thing. And if we will let God give that to us, it's not something we earn. It's like the manna in the wilderness. God gave them enough for that day. One of the passages that I love in the Old Testament is the mercies of the Lord are new every morning. And so all it means is that we have enough for that day. I showed some pictures Sunday morning. I'll show them here. You'll be able to see some of these of sheep. And when we think of green pastures, I think we think of like a golf course kind of setting with lush green grass. It's not always the case in and around Jerusalem in the areas that David would have kept sheep, that Jesus walked. in those areas. They were in the middle of a desert, the Middle East. They're in the Fertile Crescent, so there's some grassy areas, and there were times of the year when they were grassier than others. The rainy season, when the Jordan River would overflow. Again, that's the opposite of the still waters, because you don't want to get a sheep too close to huge running water and flooding and all that. But predominantly, I think even what he's offering in this passage is enough for today. The shepherd can lead the sheep along for a while, and they get what they need for that day, and then they rest. Which leads us to the second thing, which I think is rest. I think one of the things that God provides is rest. And I know that a lot of people right now might not feel rested, spiritually so, physically so, emotionally so. We're in the middle of a pandemic. There's all kinds of things going on. Schools in our area are not meeting except for online. So there's a lot of issues for which we are exhausted, I think. But I would remind you that God provided a means for us to find and keep rest in Him, and that was a Sabbath. That was a day of rest. I know that oftentimes we focus on the Old Testament, not the New, and so the Old Testament came to fulfill the Old. But Jesus said, we created Sabbath, this idea of Sabbath, this idea of rest for you. You weren't created to follow the rules. The rules were created to feed and nourish and sustain you and give you rest. And so if you are lax in keeping a day of rest, the day when we can set down all the things around us and not think about those things, is a day we can focus on God and letting Him renew us. And so I think this idea of rest, Americans aren't that good at, because we've let go of the things that we know God would have us to do. And one of those is prioritizing a day of rest that we give to God for the sake of nourishment. We've turned Sunday morning attendance into shopping at a mall. I want to go where I'm fed. I want to go where this. I want to go where that. And then after that, we're free to do what we want to. It feels like God would rather us give Him a whole day, follow His path, do the things that He would want us to do. And part of that is that I think He would draw us to a local church. And so let's be careful to follow that. If God gave that for us, why aren't we taking advantage of that? If you want rest, again, so, I don't feel very rested. Psalm 23 doesn't really apply to me. Okay, well, are you being a good sheep? Because the sheep are brought to a place of rest. And if you're not brought to that place of rest, if you don't let God bring you there, if you fight, if you make every day another day of work, I would say just that it's maybe not on God's side that you don't feel rested or aren't rested. And again, spiritually speaking, not necessarily just physically, although that's a byproduct of the spiritual rest that we have. And so as God continues to provide, it says He restores my soul. Again, an indication that He's talking about not necessarily physical restoration, but a spiritual restoration. Many of us would say, well, right now we need restoration. Right now we need restoration because we're tired and we're hungry and we're all of that. I would note to you, as we go through the things that we're talking about that God provides, including nourishment, it's not evidence that God is not around if we get hungry, because He promises to meet that need. It's not evidence that God is not around when we get tired, because God provides rest. It's not evidence that God's not around when we get worn out and worn down, because God promises to restore us. So these promises of God aren't to keep us out of harm's way. They're not that He's, in fact, the next section starts off with, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It doesn't say, yea, now that I'm with Jesus and He's my shepherd, there'd be no shadow of death. It says, the shadow of death's there, but I'm going to go with you. So a lot of people say, oh, if I follow God, I shouldn't get hungry. No, you should. You just should rest on God feeding you, nourishing you. Well, I shouldn't get tired. Yes, you should. Okay? The leading from one grassy pasture to the next is an exhausting idea. The idea that the grass runs out in this area, we need to go to greener pastures, which is the whole job of the shepherd, to take you by the next creek and the next green pasture. This one wears out if there's enough sheep. Sheep are reproducing. There's more and more sheep. Eventually the shepherd's going to look around and say, okay, this is going to run out by winter. We need to go somewhere else where there's a greener pasture. And again, the sheep looking at that grass thinking, I got enough for me today. What do I care? Well, do you have enough for the 100, 200, 300, 3,000 sheep that are with you? No, that's not your job to think about. It's the shepherd's job to think about. I would just say part of what this thing offers is not to take you out of the trouble, but to go with you and provide for you through the trouble. That's what makes the shepherd shine. And we'll talk about that one more minute. We got to talk about one more thing, and that is this idea. We have first nourishment, we have rest, we have restoration, and then direction. And that is the passage that says that we just quoted, and I'll put it back on line for us here. He restores my soul, but then he leads me in paths of righteousness. And that could be translated righteousness or right paths. Either way, it's the place where we need to go, and God's giving us that direction. God's saying this is the way that leads to greener grass, this is the way that leads to rest and restoration, and that's the other way, and that leads to further degradation, that leads to further exhaustion, that leads to further hunger, and those are the places that we go that God is not providing for us because we've wandered off as a sheep. And so this direction is something that I think we very, very much need. If we were to do a longer sermon series on the book of Psalm 23, we could certainly do that, and we could take a week to just talk about nourishment, what that means, a week talk about rest, a week to talk about restoration. We could probably do 4 weeks just on direction, letting God lead us where he would have us to go. And the trust that's required of that. The trust is a big component of the shepherd-sheep relationship. And one of the things that Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, my sheep know my voice. And so we have to develop that trust. But the issue at the end there is God providing nourishment, rest, restoration, direction. There's a reason. It gives us a reason that he did that. And this is the reason right here, for his name's sake. And so what we see in this world is that God wants for all of humankind really to follow him. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, not so that God loved the church, although the church is a part of that. The church is a part of reaching out and bringing other people in. And the way that gets accomplished a lot of times and through this metaphor is for the shepherd to shine, and for other people to look, so I need a shepherd. Look at what these Christians have. They have rest. They have restoration. And so those needs are met by a loving and faithful shepherd. And it really does then lead to a situation where our lives lived following the master shepherd, the good shepherd, speak loudly to a world around us. When Jesus came down, it said they look like sheep without a shepherd. Okay? Our neighbors are sheep without a shepherd. If they're not in church, they're not Christians. And we have an opportunity to invite them to a relationship with the Good Shepherd, where they could say, the Lord is my shepherd, where they could talk about the restoration and peace and rest and all these things that Jesus offers. And so I like to know why. I like to know why I'm doing what I'm doing, whether it matters and what's going on. And this is a big why for his name's sake. Is a big why. It's not for our name's sake. Okay, if for our name's sake, we might say, well, skip the journey and I just want to stay right here where I am and I have my grass that I'm not worried about. It's not about you. It is about bringing glory to the Father. It is about showcasing Jesus Christ. And so ultimately, the story of the Good Shepherd is about the Good Shepherd, not about the sheep. But the sheep have a critical role. And we have a blessed role. Our role is to be taken care of. Our role is to be provided for. Our role is that as we go through difficulties in life, Jesus would take care of us. So these are the nuts and bolts of what we talked about Sunday, and the message. Maybe I left out a story. Maybe I left out a little point here or there that I mentioned on Sunday. But that's the rough cut in a little under 20 minutes. And so I just wanted to kind of fill y'all in. Next Sunday, if you join us, we'll be talking about the presence of the shepherd in our lives. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. And that you are with me is a big promise in this world. See, we're not told that we're going to avoid all the problems in the world, but we are told that as we go through those, Jesus promises his presence in our lives. So I hope that you'll join us, maybe in person, if you're seeing this in time. We'll meet Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. If not, look for this next video in our series on YouTube, and hopefully that'll bless you as well. I hope that you're doing well. Our prayers are with you, and God bless you.